today is a kind of a book celebration about China's Cold War science diplomacy, published with University of Cambridge Press in August of 2022. Is that correct? Excellent. This book examines the history of China's international scientific outreach from the 1940s through to the 1970s. And Dr. Barrett argues that the Mao era was a formative period in China's science diplomacy. So he's going to be introducing to us the topic of his book and the research within this book today. So very briefly, Dr. Gordon Barrett is currently an affiliated researcher on the ERC-funded Negotiating World Research Data Project based here at the University of Manchester in the Center for the History of Science, Technology, and Medicine. He completed his PhD at the University of Bristol in 2015. Since then, he's been working at the University of Oxford as a lecturer in modern Chinese history and politics. Our discussant today, Dr. Jennifer Altehenger, who is Associate Professor of Chinese History at the University of Oxford. She's researching and teaching the history of modern and contemporary China, in particular the history of design, industry, and life under state socialist governance. So I turn it over to you, Dr. Please.
Thanks very much. Pardon me. So thank you very much for all of you for attending today, and please don't hesitate to pop up and grab sandwiches along the way. So just maybe say a little bit about the structure, about how we were thinking we'd approach it. So I'll say a little bit just to kind of set the stage and give you a sense of the basic ideas of some of the book. Jen is going to very kindly say a few words. We might do Q&A and then open it up to the audience questions might have. But speaking times, I just want to say a few others before I begin. And then first, of course, is to the Manchester China Institute for hosting the talk. We'd originally organized this back in February, which was possibly less cheeky then to be calling it a book launch than it is now. But as this is really the kind of first time I've done a proper talk on the book, I guess it's a kind of a launch in that sense. So we'll go that way. Maybe celebration is a good label too. But I especially want to thank Will and Nezra here at the MCI for all the organizational and logistical work that went into making this all happen, because we wouldn't be here without it. I also feel like it's quite fitting, actually, that this is taking place in Manchester, of all places, not least of which because of all the interest and support that I've received here from the academic community, especially the Center for the History of Science, Technology, and Medicine. Back when I was actually working on the book project when I was at Bristol. So getting to present at a work in progress workshop in the very early stages and later at a departmental seminar really was incredibly valuable to me. So I've got kind of so strong associations with this project here. So for me, it's quite exciting that my current academic home is across the way here from the MCI. And I also want to say thank you very much to Professor 𝗱𝗲𝗁 and the New World Data Project for bringing me up here as well. But most importantly, I really would like to say a huge thank you to Jen, Dr. Altehenger, for so kindly agreeing to act as a discussant and commentator for the event today and traveling up from Oxford to do so. So it's just really exciting for me to have one of the top scholars in contemporary Chinese history here to talk about the book. So anyway, thank you, Jen, for coming. Well, this might seem a little bit unorthodox, and as I pointed in entirely the wrong direction. There we go. Okay. I thought I might actually start off by saying a little bit about the book cover, and actually this has kind of informed most of what I'm going to say in this intro bit. Now, this poster, which was used for the cover, comes from the fantastic folks at the University of Westminster Archives and their really brilliant Chinese posters collection. One of the big reasons why I'm so excited to have this particular poster on the cover is that the person who's featured on there, it's not some like abstract scientist or imagined and generic, but actually a real person. And for that matter, a person who happens to be actually a really key figure in the book, and that's it's none other than 𝗱𝗲𝗁, who is a very, very eminent geologist. Now, the text on the bottom of the poster, which is basically impossible to read here, I think, but is another reason why I love it, even if it didn't make it onto the cover. And the reason for that is because it explicitly sets up 𝗱𝗲𝗁 as a model scientist. as a patriotic exemplar. As I say, it's a bit tricky to read, but just for the sake of time, I'll do a kind of rough translation, which is do well in scientific research for the revolution, make more contributions for the homeland, learned from Comrade 𝗘𝗃𝗲𝘁. Now, this was one of many posters with kind of riffing on these themes from the late 70s and early 80s, talking about patriotically devoting oneself to study and work in the service of China's scientific and technological development. When it was released, this poster came out in early 1979, I think January, the People's Republic was, of course, in the midst of a fairly seismic political transition, right, that has accompanied Deng Xiaoping's rise to power as paramount leader of both the country and the Chinese Communist Party, and the onset of what was going to become known as the era of reform. One of the most iconic policy drives, of course, which was the so-called four modernizations, prioritizing science and technology development, agriculture, industry, and defense. Now, while the four modernizations may be so strongly associated with the post-Mao era, with the late 70s onward, of course, neither the term nor that broader conception underpinning it were, of course, brand new, and instead were explicit riffs, right, on something that had been articulated most prominently in the early 60s by John Nye and Neil Ogden and others. So you have this kind of direct connection to a decade beforehand. And of course, that's no accident, right? For all the change that's taking place in that period, and the rhetoric and association of change by which it's been, especially retrospectively, viewed and characterized, it's important, I think, not to forget the significance of the practical and rhetorical continuities between now and now periods, right? And nor is it an accident that the poster featuring 𝗘𝗃𝗲𝘁 is actually, when it comes to these priorities, is linking the revolutionary, like this discussion of scientific research, either, right? And it's another signifier, I think, of these continuities. And in fact, the very choice of 𝗘𝗃𝗲𝘁 himself as a modern scientist is also similarly one. So he had actually passed away about 8 years prior to the poster's release. He died in 1971. And it's safe to say, that China's domestic and international political context in 79 was very much different from 71 when he died, or for that matter, in the previous decades in which he'd been living and working. Now, there's no question that the 70s were a time, as I say, of political change, not just domestically, but internationally, right? Because if we think of the year of his death, this marked the PRC taking up China's seat in the United Nations in place of the Republic of China, which had previously held it since the union's founding. The following year saw Richard Nixon's iconic visit to China, the event that remains really the most potent symbol of the dramatic fall, the signing of American relations in that period. And in fact, of course, the poster's publication in early 79 release it closely coincides with the formal establishment of relations between the United States and the PRC. Now, it's that period starting in the 1970s, in the twilight years of the Mao era, and then continuing to the early years of the Deng era, which is typically really framed as the moment when the starting gun, right, is fired on the PRC's integration into the international scientific system. And for that matter, a period in which state-sponsored scientific exchange is seen as playing a prominent role in supporting China's wider effort, diplomatic and efforts and agendas, right? It's not just ping pong players going back and forth, it's scientists as well. And then we have a great and actually still growing body of scholarship on that particular period and topic. The two key questions that really drove my research for this book were, okay, where does the Mao era fit into this, right? And if we're thinking in this bigger picture, where again, is this a question of more continuities or changes across either 1949 and the foundation of the PRC, or 78 or 76 even following Sloan's death, right? Where does this all fit in? So that's a big reason for why the book itself, the first empirical chapter, starts in 1946, right? With starting in the midst of the Chinese Civil War, but also the founding of an organization that kind of runs through the thread of the book, which is the World Federation of Scientific Workers, which is founded in 1946 as well. And for me, the World Federation in particular became very clear, was a kind of something of a kind of connective tissue that ran across a whole bunch of different types of activities as a kind of enabler. And similarly, why the book's final empirical chapter that's looking more at Sino-British relationships between scientists strays well into the 1970s. And then, of course, the concluding chapters focus more on legacies and again, it's kind of questions of continuities even to the present day, and questions of, again, China's very conspicuous rise as a scientific, technological, and medical superpower in recent decades. And so in its most fundamental terms, really what I'm aiming within this book is to delve into the development, first, of the Chinese Communist Party's support for international scientific outreach, both before and during the People's Republic of China under Deng, and then also to kind of explore, in a sense, more structurally, the strategies and structures that supported this international outreach, and how these fit within a wider spectrum of foreign affairs strategies, really rooted in particular in the United Front. So to return to the cover, I love this poster so much because it not only taps into some of these arguments and ideas, but also because of it featuring Lisa Guo. Now, of course, the poster's focus is on scientific research, but what I would argue is that one of the reasons why Li was such an obvious choice for a subject to promote as a model, a patriotic scientist, was as much for his activities outside of the laboratory as they were within it. His public persona and profile were unquestionably central in his suitability for such status, and that's something that similarly made him well suited to foreign affairs work in which he engaged and which featured in this book. Now, as my research for this project evolved, he was a figure who kind of emerged as a key member of a cohort, really, of scientists who sat at the core of this international scientific outreach during the early decades of the Cold War. Now, this group of internationally active scientists represent the country's scientific community, of course, but also for many of the foreign scientists with whom they interacted, they ended up embodying malware science and acted as essential interlocutors. Now, one of the key dynamics that historians have identified, right, and emphasized in 20th century Chinese science is that of its scientific communities highly internationalized network, right? Now, when I say that, I mean they had very strong international connections across very formative and key aspects of their careers, whether it's education at international institutions inside China, to undertaking degrees and spending years working overseas as well. So, in particular, influential historians of science, such as Zhou Liwan or 𝗱𝗲𝘁 have emphasized really the importance of Americanization, in particular, when it comes to China's scientific community in the 20th century, but also the kind of formation of domestic institutional structures across that period. Now, yeah, the United States was unquestionably important in a variety of ways when it came to the trajectory of 20th century Chinese science, and that included its foreign scientific relations. And of course, that's reflected to an extent in members of the elites, that elite cohort of science who served as those interlocutors. So, for example, meteorologist 𝗘𝗃𝗃𝗀 was in many respects the archetypal American-educated Chinese scientist. He had studied at the University of Illinois and then Harvard in the 1910s, and then subsequently returned to China and, of course, became a key academic administrator, very feature of both the Communists and the Communists. And perhaps foremost within the cohort was the bloke on the other side, 𝗘𝗃𝗃𝗀, who had studied at the University of Chicago and then later worked at Caltech, and then briefly also with Einstein, actually, at Princeton's Institute for Advanced Study before, well, he moved back and forth between China and the United States, right, and I think on a number of occasions. But particularly in the early decades of the People's Republic, of course, during the period in which the United States is China's main geopolitical antagonist, what this book aims to show is that the dimensions of internationalization that we need to think about, there are other ones that are incredibly important. So if we return to 𝗘𝘃𝗲𝘁 again, right? The US connections are typically those that are placed front and center, not least because, as you can see, he passed away in 1993. So actually played a hugely, in many ways, outsized role in the Sino-American context in the 80s, right up until his death in the early 90s. But it's important for him, for example, to not forget that he also had significant connections in Western Europe early in his career. So after he finished his PhD, he worked with Werner Heisenberg and Wolfgang Pauli and other members of the cohort of scientists. In fact, places like Europe were in fact more important for them than the United States. So the physicist 𝗘𝘃𝗲𝘁 had studied in France and become a friend and academic collaborator with Frederick and Irene Joliot-Curie. Meteorologist 𝗘𝘃𝗲𝘁 studied here in the UK at Imperial College and then University of Liverpool. Meanwhile, 𝗘𝘃𝗲𝘁 had strong ties to the UK too. So he'd studied at the University of Birmingham, and his daughter, Li Lin, who was an incredibly accomplished physicist herself, also did postgraduate study at Birmingham before moving to Cambridge, and that's where she met and married biochemist Zhou Chengwu, who again, this was kind of a proper scientific dynasty in terms of cats and technicians. Anyway, all of that international experience and those international ties, right, are really a core part of like 𝗘𝘃𝗲𝘁, 𝗘𝘃𝗲𝘁, and 𝗘𝘃𝗲𝘁, their international friendships, their professional relationships with fellow scientists, their scientific networks, the respect that they're afforded, born of the direct experience those overseas colleagues have of them working alongside them. These are all qualities, right, which made them ideal interlocutors, both for China's scientific community, but also for the country's foreign policymakers seeking to increase China's influence overseas, and in particular to kind of win hearts and minds among foreign scientific communities. Now, the other key focus of the book, and yeah, thank you, when it comes to China's state-supported international scientific engagement, is on the role played by international organizations and events. And in some ways, this was an effort on my part to try and move beyond a primary focus on things like bilateral relationships, right, and exchanges to broaden our understanding a bit more on some of the other kinds of transnational dimensions of this kind of engagement. And so with the representatives of the Republic of China, of course based in Taiwan, already having a well-established presence in many key international scientific organizations like, say, ICSU, or the organizations and agencies within the United Nations system, such as UNESCO, right? Being on the outside of all these international organizations, and the malware has very typically been kind of cast as, okay, this is the example of why China is isolated from international science in the period. And then again, to return to the 70s briefly, right, this transformation and the rapid entry into many of them, of course, it has an incredibly transformative effect on the country's scientific engagement, as much as the bilateral breakthrough, say, in particular in the Sino-American case, did. But this doesn't mean that the dramatic developments of the 70s and the 80s somehow negate there being activities that happened before, right? In many ways, the 50s and 60s create foundations which are built on later. And in the 50s and 60s, instead, international scientific outreach took place in different channels and in different spaces, right? So for China, involvement in many of these were interlinked and interconnected, not just because of the involvement of that cluster of scientists, right, involved in foreign affairs work, but also between organizations and events as well. So for example, the book, as I mentioned, traces how involvement in the World Federation of Scientific Workers was not only closely interlinked with things like bilateral exchanges, particularly within the socialist bloc, but also fed directly into participation in things like the early Pugwash conferences on science and world affairs, which started in 1957. Now, the Pugwash conferences are basically a prominent example of epistemic community building related to issues of nuclear proliferation, as well as acting as a site of informal contact, and even in some instances, track 2 diplomacy across the remainder of the Cold War and actually since. Now, the involvement in the World Federation of Scientific Workers, or more specifically, in some ways, the breakdown in China's relations with the organization in the 1960s in the wake of developments such as the Sino-Soviet split, also fed directly into the country, hosting 2 of the biggest international science congresses of the Mao era. And that's the Peking Science Symposium in 1964, which again is a fascinating kind of historical moment. 64 is, and a spin-off summer physics book in 1966, and the kind of just at the start of the Cultural Revolution. And as much as individual scientists' involvement in international organizations like the World Federation, or their interaction with individual foreign scientists, these very large-scale science conferences were heavily choreographed, very expensive, incidentally as well, but events that interwove elements of scientific exchange, propaganda, and activism that all fit well within a wider spectrum of international outreach activities that aimed at extending the PRC's global reach and influence. And again, the foreign policymakers had a very active role in steering creating. Anyway, we'll leave it at, I'll leave it at that, but hopefully that gives you a kind of general idea of some of the things that are in the book.
Well, thank you very much, Gordon. So as Gordon briefly said at the beginning, what we thought we'd do is, he was, as he just wonderfully did, going to introduce the book. I get to do the wonderful thing of celebrating it in ever so many ways, and drawing out a couple of things that I think this book does wonderfully, and how it changes the story. And then I will ask a couple of questions, so Gordon and I will have a bit of a dialogue, and the dialogue should hopefully I can actually lead over to your questions. So get your questions ready. You'll have a chance very soon. Now, simply put, this is a wonderful book. Read it, have fun. I enjoyed it. It's there are these brilliantly written books that are both really rich in material they offer, the perspective they show, the stories they tell, what you didn't know about, and you come away thinking, oh wow, that changed my mental picture of this era. This is one of those books. And it's always nice to see that diplomacy can do that. Because occasionally when it comes to the history of the People's Republic of China, we do have a little bit too much diplomacy, and sometimes we think, let's get beyond the diplomacy. Well, Gordon makes a wonderful case to draw us back into the diplomacy by saying there's so much we haven't actually looked at before. Now, his conclusion starts with a wonderful sentence, which I'm going to quote because I thought it just encapsulates the book in many ways, and that's, and I quote, Mao's China was isolated from international science, or so the story goes. And the entire book is really about how that story is actually a different one. And you're then right, and I think that's 𝗱𝗲𝘁 who says this, and you say so as well, that we need to redraw the map of science. We very much need to redraw the map of modern China more generally. 20th century, post-49, we have a lot of redrawing to do. And lots of people are redrawing, which is exciting to see. It's a really vibrant field to be working in. And in many ways, I think that's exactly what you do. You start redrawing in every single one of the chapters of this book. And let me draw out a couple of ways, didn't just say draw, in which you redraw, not to overuse them. So the first point, I think, that comes out really strongly, and you mentioned this as well just now in your introduction, is that you show how science diplomacy, internationalization, didn't just start in the early 1970s. Now, it's important to remind us of that moment of the early 1970s, because in many ways, those of you who might work on the history of China in the United Nations may have already foreseen this. We know much less about China in the United Nations in the 70s and 80s than we do about it in the 90s, 2000s, and after. And we know significantly less about China in the People's Republic of China in the United Nations after 71, in institutions other than the General Assembly, in institutions other than the Security Council. So there's rich story to be told about Chinese people, the People's Republic of China's presence in the United Nations, in many of its different institutions and organizations. One I think you very strongly contribute to, but then you also say powerfully and convincingly that we need to actually link all of this to the 50s and the 60s and to what had come before. And this is more than a continuity point. You're not to say, well, there have been continuities, where of course the historian goes, that would not be, in a way. And in a way, all of us have to do this. We have to, the initial, I know this so well from my own work, is to go, yay, there's a continuity, and then to say, well, that's actually the least exciting bit. The exciting bit is, why does the continuity matter? What does it actually do? And I think you do that convincingly. This is what I'm currently trying to write myself, and it's exactly what I constantly run into. I have this, oh my God, there are continuities, and I think, yeah, not enough, gotta push it. So you do that, and you do this wonderfully, because one thing you do as well, and that also came out in your presentation, is by giving that this sense of continuity, you draw us away from the centrality of the US context. You say the US is important, but there is more. And especially for the 60s, and I'm going to get back to this later on, it isn't the Soviet Union, it isn't just the US, it is all these actors we haven't looked at before. And for those of you who, and I think many might work on China in the 1960s, that's the moment they trade quite actively with Western Europe. That's the moment when so-called capitalist countries are a major point of contact. And that's a story that many of us know was there. People who lived through the time knew it was there. But it somehow constantly falls off the equivalent of the flat world of modern Chinese history. There's a temptation that that's the part where it's thought, and we need to keep on saying, no, the world is round. Now, the second point you make, which I found really compelling, is that you say science diplomacy is a serious subject of analysis, and it's not just people having dinners. When we actually look at science diplomacy, we need to think about communist China as a real actor and agent in this wider world of engagement, which meant for me that we start, and this is something I remember fighting with when I worked on the history of law, we take science and politics seriously. Now, that means not using politics as a reason not to look at the science, not to take seriously the diplomacy, but also asking, well, what does politics actually mean in different places at different times? So what is the politics involved in the science diplomacy? How did people feel about it when how did your scientists, go out and try to navigate this world, which they knew was profoundly political, but that was the point. So bring us back to a history of politics, to a political history that is more than an intellectual history. It's really thinking about a vision of the world, which included communist China, but many other countries as well, where people said absolutely everything is political. There is no way it couldn't be. And what does that mean for science? What does that mean for other parts of everyday life? And so it's not just about bringing politics in, but it's about taking seriously that way of understanding the world at the time, and taking seriously the Mao era as a result. Now, one of the things for those of you who might not work on the Mao era, one thing we constantly emphasize is this was a period that many people thought of as it was a transitional period. It wasn't what people were building in the moment was meant to lead to something else. They were building towards socialism, they were building towards communism, and that world view is one a historian today has to remind themselves of. What did that actually mean to live in a constantly transitional world? What did scientists therefore think they were working towards, and how did they understand their working? And in a way, this means that your international scientific encounters become a form of world making. So not just politics, but also state making, as you say in your book, but also world making, ways of thinking the world through science. And in a way, well, not in a way, actually, throughout the book, but I thought you did very, very well, and I really enjoyed reading, is that you profoundly humanize this history of world making. We profoundly humanize the people involved, how they're thinking, what their positionality might be, how they're understanding themselves in this transitional moment of working towards socialism, of trying to understand what can science do in trying to create a new society, what can science do in trying to create as many believed at the time, potentially more equal, more just world, and how does that affect us and the world we live in. So in a way, your scientists for me were both science diplomats and diplomatic scientists. And I like that duality in the way they have to think about the world. And the other thing you do very compellingly is that's the last point. You do a lot more things incredibly well, but I'm just throwing a couple out also for you maybe to ask questions if you're interested about this, is that you expand the space of science diplomacy we usually pay attention to. So we like to pay, and I think I do this myself, the conferences, the meeting minutes. That's the way that the textual material, the archival record, crosses into these meetings. We look at discussion in meetings. And yet, we all know how conferences work, how meetings work. It's the stuff that happens outside. You know, at one point, I'm not quite sure what anymore, when somebody gets pulled aside in the 1960s, you know, you have this, you know, what's going on? And this what's going on is so difficult to grasp, but it's so essential to the way people network and how they work. So you have the classic pretty offices, conference rooms and spaces of your science diplomats and diplomatic scientists, but then restaurants, dinner venues, potentially homes, the lab, buses, airports, and bringing that really rich material dimension of interactions back into the narrative as more than background, as setting, as potentially impetus, as possibly impediment. I think is something that I took away from the book and I find quite compelling. Now on to my main question, and I'm sure we're not going to get through it, but let me start actually with that aspect of humanity and humanizing science diplomacy. Can you actually tell us a little bit more, for those who haven't actually read the book, a little bit more about the scientists beyond their key role in the diplomacy? Who were these people?
So, thank you. I should say all the comments in kind words as well. And I think, so to kind of go back to link this to what you're saying, I mean, I think that was a kind of a ball of yarn. That's kind of very difficult to untangle. And I mean, I try to do a little bit of it in the book, but only kind of up to a point in some ways, because it's that entanglement of the personal and the professional that is a big through line to this. That I mean, when I'm thinking about the networks themselves, and again, those scientists, and in a sense, why they're both personally motivated to do these things, but also why they are seen as useful, is because it's the relationships that they have with others that kind of makes them so powerful as kind of communicators and as linkage points. And so with those private lines, I mean, this becomes, again, a tricky one with sources, right? In terms of where you're drawing the material, but even, you know, and this is where I try, for example, with Pugwash, because there's an interesting dynamic with Japan where, and this is a very rare thing, he's entrusted to travel to the first two conferences entirely on his own. No translator, right? Nobody basically watching over and mediating those interactions and having them the outside, which again is, in a sense, an incredible position of trust, which incidentally the Soviets did not extend to their own representatives at that first Pugwash meeting. That allows the aspects of the personal to come through. So the fact that, again, the logistics of travel, the fact that you have to make multiple plane hops across, and you know, he has a transition point in the UK at which both he gets an embassy briefing or a 𝗱𝗲𝗁 briefing. Technically, it's 𝗱𝗲𝗁 office at that stage, but also then links up with an acquaintance of his, who then they fly over to Canada together, right? And to my mind, the chaps have even negotiating jet lag together. is kind of a part of that. And we do get glimpses. So Joe Palin's daughter wrote a really fascinating piece about her dad's experiences at Pugwash. And one of the things she mentions is that he gets to, I think it's Montreal before he goes to Nova Scotia. And he gets on the phone and he starts ringing friends and scientists who are particularly based in the United States to basically pass on news about relatives, about family back home, and also to pick up messages that he can then kindly relay. And reading that for me was a kind of particular moment because it really put in place that even when you're reading his reports to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, that there's this very careful negotiation that he's also doing in those kinds of very official spaces even on the page. Anyway, that's maybe partial.
So let me follow up with a question here,
Yeah.
because most of the guys you showed were guys.
Mhm.
And there is Dorothy Hodgkins, of course, in the story. And I was wondering, and this comes from some of the research I did on lawyers. Again, most of whom were men, but they tended to have incredibly influential partners, family members. So is this also the case here? I mean, so do we have on one hand, what's the role of women scientists in your story at the level of our science diplomats? And then what's the role of family members at sort of broader level of networking?
Of course. So yeah, it's quite striking. That's actually one of the reasons I put the picture on that slide in. So gender is a very, I would say, important vector in this, in a variety of contexts. I mean, there's an interesting dynamic. So all of those guys were male, and of that kind of core group of people who keep coming across are very much male. There's an interesting dynamic, again, going back to Pugwash as an example, the 6th Pugwash conference. Again, she travels unofficially as an advisor. She's not technically a member of the delegation, which again reflects in some ways the gender politics of the Pugwash conferences at that time as well, where Dorothy Hodgkin and Kathleen Lonsdale are notable exceptions for being actual attendees, that you have equally famous and influential female scientists who are spouses of the named attendees who happen to be there, and of course are participating in the more important stuff that happens outside of the events. But anyway, to go back to the Chinese delegation, Zhang Zonghan, who at that time is in an advisor capacity, she goes on to actually, again, play a very important role in negotiations, especially with, for example, the United Nations. But again, she's kind of relegated more to the background. What's interesting, if you flip that around against that last chapter, you mentioned Dorothy Hodgkin and then Kathleen Lonsdale. So that chapter looks at 6, that's correctly, but a group of kind of British scientists, and part of that is trying to see kind of the similarities and differences between the nature of their engagement. What's really striking to me is, again, you mentioned positionality before, right? For both Hodgkin and Lonsdale, they are hyper aware of their positionality. And gender is kind of a very important part of that. And that informs a lot of their interests and answers. And they are, when you're looking at their travel diaries and correspondence, that's an area of priority. And they're very excited to be meeting and frankly encountering in prominent positions in China a lot more women than they're used to seeing back home. They noticed that. Now, it's worth also saying their hosts are very much aware of that positionality and interest as well, and so are ensuring that those types of encounters do take place. So it threads through in a lot of very interesting ways.